The year was 1971. Uganda, a beautiful country in the heart of Africa, was about to face its darkest chapter. A man named Idi Amin Dada was rising to power, and with him came death, fear, and destruction that would last for 8 terrible years. Uganda had been free from British rule for only 9 years. The country was young, hopeful, and full of promise. Its people came from many different tribes and backgrounds. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and had different customs, but they all shared the same dream of building a better future for their children. The capital city, Kampala, sat on green hills beside Lake Victoria. Markets bustled with traders selling colorful fabrics, fresh fruits, and handmade crafts. Children ran through the streets, playing games and laughing. Farmers worked their fields, growing coffee, cotton, and bananas. Teachers taught in schools. Doctors treated patients in hospitals. Life was normal, life was peaceful. But this peace would not last long. In the presidential palace, a giant of a man was planning something terrible. Idi Amin stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 250 pounds. His voice was deep and commanding. When he walked into a room, people noticed him immediately. He had the build of a heavyweight boxer and the presence of a natural leader. But behind his charming smile and hearty laugh, something dark was growing. Amin had been a soldier for most of his adult life. He started as a simple private in the British colonial army when Uganda was still under British control. The British officers liked him because he was strong, brave, and willing to follow orders without question. He could not read or write very well, but he understood power, he understood fear, and he understood how to use both to get what he wanted. For years, Amin had been watching and learning. He watched how the British controlled the local people through force and intimidation. He learned that people would obey anyone who could hurt them badly enough. He discovered that fear was more powerful than love, respect, or loyalty. These lessons would shape everything he did when he became the ruler of Uganda. The current president, Milton Obote, trusted Amin completely. They have been friends and allies for many years. Obote thought Amin was loyal, simple, and harmless. He was wrong about all 3 things. Amin was planning to take over the government, and he was planning to rule in a way that would shock the world. Most Ugandans did not know what was coming. They went about their daily lives, working, studying, raising their families, and planning for the future. They did not know that their neighbor might soon disappear in the middle of the night. They did not know that speaking the wrong words could mean death. They did not know that their country was about to become a place where human life had no value. The warning signs were there, but few people saw them. Amin had already shown his cruel nature during his years as a military officer. He had tortured prisoners. He had killed people without trial. He had stolen money and supplies. But these crimes happened far from the capital, in remote areas where few people could witness them. Those who did see often kept quiet out of fear. International observers were also blind to the danger. Western countries saw Amin as a strong military leader who could bring stability to Uganda. They thought he was better than the politicians who seemed to argue and fight all the time. Some even thought he might be good for business and trade. They could not imagine the horror that was about to unfold. The signs of what Amin would become were hidden in his past. As a young soldier, he had served in Kenya during the violent Momo uprising. He had learned brutal techniques for fighting rebels and controlling populations. He had seen how violence could break people's spirits and make them obey. He had watched how fear could spread through communities like a disease, making everyone afraid to resist or speak out. Amin was not educated in the traditional sense. He could barely read simple words and could not write much more than his own name. But he had a different kind of intelligence. He understood people's weaknesses. He knew how to manipulate emotions. He could sense when someone was afraid, ambitious, or greedy, and he knew exactly how to use these feelings to control them. The man who would soon rule Uganda was also deeply superstitious. He believed in magic, spirits, and prophecies. He thought that eating the organs of his enemies would give him their strength and wisdom. He believed that certain rituals could protect him from harm. These strange beliefs would later influence many of his most terrible decisions. In 1971, Uganda was like a beautiful house built on a foundation of sand. Everything looked solid and strong from the outside, but underneath, cracks were already forming. The different ethnic groups did not always trust each other. The economy depended too heavily on one group of people. The military was poorly organized and easily corrupted. The government was weak and divided. Amin saw all these weaknesses and he planned to use them. He knew that fear could unite people just as easily as hope could divide them. He understood that in times of chaos, people often welcome anyone who promises to restore order, even if that person is a monster. As 1971 began, Uganda stood at a crossroads. One path led to continued growth, democracy, and prosperity. The other path led to darkness, death, and destruction. The Ugandan people did not know they were about to be forced down the second path by a man who would prove to be one of the most brutal dictators in human history. The stage was set, the main character was ready, and the tragedy that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives was about to begin. This is the story of how Idi Amin Dada transformed from a simple soldier into a monster who would terrorize an entire nation and shock the world with his cruelty. The nightmare was about to start, and it would last for 8 long, dark years that Uganda would never forget. Idi Amin Dada was born around 1925 in a small village called Koboko, near the border between Uganda and Sudan. His exact birth date remains unknown because few records were kept in rural Uganda during those times. His mother, Asaat, belonged to the Lugbara tribe, while his father was from the Kakwa people. Both tribes lived simple lives as farmers and herders in the remote northwestern region of Uganda. The village where Amin grew up was far from any major cities or towns. Most people lived in small mud huts with grass roofs. They grew their own food, raised goats and chickens, and traded with neighboring villages for things they could not make themselves. Life was hard but peaceful. Children helped their parents with farming and learned the old ways from their elders. Amin was different from other children in his village. He was much larger and stronger than boys his age. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already as tall as many grown men. His size made him useful for heavy work, but it also made him stand out. Some villagers thought his unusual size was a sign that he would do great things. Others worried that it meant trouble. The boy who would become one of history's most feared dictators could not read or write. His family was too poor to send him to school, and there were very few schools in their remote area anyway. Instead of learning from books, young Amin learned about life from watching the adults around him. He saw how the strongest men became village leaders. He noticed how people obeyed those who could fight well. These early lessons about power would stay with him forever. When Amin was still a teenager, his life changed completely. British colonial officers came to his village looking for young men to join the King's African Rifles, the colonial army. They wanted soldiers who were big, strong, and brave. Amin fit perfectly. In 1946, at about 21 years old, he left his village and became a soldier. The British Army was very different from village life. Everything was organized and disciplined. Soldiers had to wake up early, exercise, clean their weapons, and follow orders without question. For many young Africans, this was difficult and strange, but Amin loved it. He enjoyed the structure, the uniforms, and especially the power that came with being a soldier. His British officers quickly noticed that Amin was special. He was not only big and strong, but also fearless in battle. When other soldiers were scared, Amin stayed calm. When fighting was dangerous, he volunteered to go first. He seemed to enjoy violence in a way that made even experienced officers uncomfortable. But they needed soldiers like him, so they promoted him and gave him more responsibility. In the early 1950s, Amin was sent to Kenya to fight against the Momo rebellion. The Momo were Kenyan fighters who wanted to end British rule and take back their land. The British colonial government was determined to crush this rebellion, and they used extremely brutal methods to do it. Amin learned these methods well. During his time in Kenya, Amin discovered that he had a talent for interrogation and torture. He could make prisoners talk when other soldiers failed. He seemed to understand how to break people's spirits through pain and fear. His British commanders found this useful, even though many of them were disturbed by his methods. They gave him more prisoners to interrogate and more enemies to hunt down. The lessons Amin learned in Kenya would later shape how he ruled Uganda. He saw how a small group of determined people could control a much larger population through terror. He learned that if you hurt people badly enough, they would tell you anything you wanted to hear. He discovered that fear was more effective than kindness for getting people to obey. After Kenya, Amin served in Somalia, where he continued to build his reputation as a fierce and ruthless soldier. He was promoted to sergeant, then to sergeant major. This was unusual for an African soldier in the British colonial army. Most Africans were kept in low ranks, but Amin's size, strength, and willingness to use violence made him valuable to his commanders. During his military service, Amin also became famous for his physical abilities. He was an excellent swimmer and a skilled boxer. In 1951, he won the heavyweight boxing championship of Uganda. He could lift enormous weights and run long distances without getting tired. These achievements made him well known throughout the Ugandan military and gave him confidence that he was superior to other men. But there was a dark side to Amin's personality that was becoming more obvious as the years passed. He was quick to anger and slow to forgive. He held grudges against anyone who he thought had insulted or wronged him. He began to show signs of the paranoia that would later consume him as a dictator. He trusted very few people and was always suspicious that others were plotting against him. In 1961, Uganda was preparing for independence from Britain. The colonial government needed African officers to take over leadership roles in the new Ugandan army. Despite his lack of formal education, Amin was promoted to lieutenant. This was an enormous jump in rank and responsibility. Suddenly, the village boy who could not read or write was commanding other soldiers and making important military decisions. The promotion changed Amin's view of himself. He began to believe that he was destined for greatness. He started to think that his humble background and lack of education did not matter because he had natural leadership abilities that other people lacked. He became more confident, more ambitious, and more dangerous. It was during this time that Amin first met Milton Obote, who would become Uganda's first prime minister after independence. Obote was impressed by Amin's size, strength, and military record. He thought that having a loyal military commander like Amin would help him maintain power in the new Uganda. This was the beginning of a relationship that would eventually destroy both men and bring terrible suffering to the Ugandan people. As Uganda moved toward independence in 1962, Amin was positioned to become one of the most powerful men in the new nation. Now he was ready to use these skills for his own purposes. The simple village boy had become a dangerous soldier, and the dangerous soldier was about to become something much worse. January 25, 1971 started like any other day in Uganda. People woke up early, prepared their breakfast, and began their daily routines. Children walked to school carrying their books and lunch. Farmers headed to their fields to tend their crops. Shop owners opened their stores in Kampala and other towns across the country. Nobody knew that before the sun set, their world would change forever. President Milton Obote was thousands of miles away in Singapore, attending a Commonwealth conference with other world leaders. He felt safe leaving Uganda because he trusted his army commander completely. That army commander was Idi Amin, the giant soldier who had served him faithfully for many years. Obote believed that Amin was too simple and too loyal to ever betray him. This was the biggest mistake of his life. For months, Amin had been planning something that would shock Uganda and the world. He was not the simple, uneducated soldier that everyone thought he was. Behind his broad smile and hearty laugh, he was carefully watching, listening, and preparing. He had been building support among certain military officers. He had been identifying his enemies and making lists of people who might oppose him. Most importantly, he had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Obote left the country. On the morning of January 25th, Amin called together a group of loyal officers at the military headquarters in Kampala. He told them that President Obote was planning to arrest and execute many army officers, including Amin himself. This was not true, but the officers believed him. Fear is a powerful weapon, and Amin knew how to use it well. The plan was simple but effective. Amin's soldiers would take control of key locations around the country. They would capture the radio stations, the airports, the government buildings, and the banks. They would arrest or kill anyone who tried to resist. Within hours, Amin would control Uganda completely. At exactly 6 in the morning, the coup began. Soldiers loyal to Amin surrounded the presidential palace, the parliament building, and the main radio station in Kampala. Other military units moved quickly to secure important locations in other cities and towns. The operation was well planned and executed with military precision. Most Ugandans were still sleeping when their government was overthrown. The few government officials who were awake and tried to resist were quickly overwhelmed. Some were arrested immediately. Others fled to neighboring countries. A few tried to contact President Obote in Singapore, but the telephone lines had been cut. Within 6 hours, Amin controlled all the important institutions in Uganda. At noon, Amin appeared on the radio to speak to the Ugandan people. His deep voice filled homes, shops, and offices across the country. He announced that he had taken control of the government to save Uganda from corruption and tribalism. He promised to end the divisions between different ethnic groups. He said he would improve the economy and make life better for ordinary Ugandans. He claimed that President Obote had been planning to destroy the army and rule as a dictator. Many Ugandans who heard this announcement were not upset. In fact, some were happy. President Obote had become unpopular in recent years. The economy was struggling. There had been tensions between different tribes and regions. Some people thought that a strong military leader might be exactly what Uganda needed. They believed Amin when he promised to fix these problems. The international community also reacted positively at first. British officials thought that Amin would be easier to work with than Obote, who had been moving Uganda towards socialism. Israeli advisors had been training Amin's forces and saw him as a reliable ally. Even some African leaders welcomed the change, hoping that Amin would bring stability to the region. Within days of the coup, Amin began to show his true nature. He ordered the arrest of hundreds of army officers who had been loyal to Obote. He told people that these men were traitors who deserved to die. But instead of putting them on trial, he had them executed immediately. The killings took place in military barracks away from public view. Most Ugandans did not know that their new leader had already begun murdering his own soldiers. Amin also moved quickly to eliminate anyone who might challenge his power. He appointed new ministers and governors, choosing only people who he thought would obey him without question. He promoted soldiers who had supported the coup and demoted or arrested those who seemed unreliable. Within weeks, he had replaced most of the government with his own supporters. The new dictator was very careful about his public image during these early months. When he appeared in public, he smiled broadly and spoke about unity, progress, and prosperity. He wore his military uniform with pride and carried himself like a confident leader. He shook hands with ordinary people and listened to their problems. Many Ugandans began to think that maybe this big, friendly soldier would indeed make their lives better. But behind the scenes, the killing had already begun. Intelligence officers who had served under Obote started disappearing. University professors who had criticized the coup were arrested in the middle of the night. Journalists who asked too many questions found themselves in prison. Business leaders who seemed too close to the old government were accused of corruption and executed without trial. Amin was methodical in his approach to consolidating power. He studied lists of potential enemies and dealt with them one by one. He used his network of spies and informers to identify anyone who might pose a threat. He rewarded loyalty with promotions and punishments, and he punished disloyalty with death. Within 6 months of the coup, he had eliminated most of the people who could have organized effective resistance against him. The man who had promised to unite Uganda was actually dividing it more than ever before. He began to favor his own ethnic group, the Kakwa, over others. He appointed Kakwa officers to important positions and gave them special privileges. This created resentment among other groups and planted the seeds of the ethnic violence that would later tear the country apart. By the end of 1971, it was becoming clear that Amin was not the simple, well-meaning soldier that people had thought. The mask was beginning to slip, revealing the monster underneath. The coup that had seemed like a solution to Uganda's problems was actually the beginning of a nightmare that would last for 8 terrible years. By the summer of 1971, The friendly mask that Idi Amin had worn during his first months in power was beginning to crack. The man who had promised peace and unity was slowly revealing his true nature. What started as isolated arrests and quiet executions was growing into something much more terrible. Uganda was about to discover what kind of monster now ruled their country. The first clear sign of the horror to come happened in July 1971. Amin ordered the mass arrest of soldiers from the Akoli and Lengi tribes, the same ethnic groups that former President Obote belonged to. Amin claimed these soldiers were planning to overthrow him and bring Obote back to power. This was not true, but truth did not matter to Amin. What mattered was eliminating anyone who might threaten his rule. Hundreds of soldiers were taken from their barracks in the middle of the night. They were loaded into trucks like cattle and driven to remote military camps. Their families were told they were being transferred to other duties. In reality, they were being taken to their deaths. Within days, mass graves in isolated areas began filling with bodies. The killing machine that would terrorize Uganda for 8 years had begun its work. Amin did not just kill his victims quickly. He seemed to enjoy making them suffer. Survivors who managed to escape later told horrifying stories of what happened in his torture centers. Soldiers were beaten with clubs and metal bars until their bones broke. They were burned with hot irons and cut with knives. Some were forced to kill their own friends and relatives. Others were made to dig their own graves before being shot. The dictator's paranoia grew stronger every day. He began to see enemies everywhere, even among his closest supporters. Officers who had helped him take power suddenly found themselves under suspicion. Ministers who had served him faithfully were accused of betrayal. Nobody was safe from his growing madness. Even laughing at the wrong time or asking the wrong question could mean death. Amin established a network of spies and informers throughout Uganda. Neighbors were encouraged to report on neighbors. Students were told to watch their teachers. Workers were asked to inform on their bosses. Children were taught to listen to their parents' conversations and report anything suspicious. The entire country became a place where trust died and fear ruled. The State Research Bureau became Amin's main tool of terror. This was supposed to be Uganda's intelligence service, but under Amin it became something much worse. The Bureau's agents could arrest anyone at any time for any reason. They did not need evidence or warrants. They answered only to Amin himself. Their headquarters in Kampala became known as the place where people went in but never came out. Inside the State Research Bureau's buildings, unimaginable horrors took place daily. Prisoners were kept in tiny cells without windows or toilets. They were given little food or water. Many died from starvation, disease, or injuries from torture before they could even be questioned. Those who survived the initial treatment faced interrogation sessions that could last for days or weeks. The torture methods used were designed to cause maximum pain and terror. Electric shocks were applied to sensitive parts of the body. Fingernails and toenails were pulled out with pliers. Prisoners were hung upside down and beaten. Some were forced to watch as their family members were tortured or killed. The screams from the torture centers could be heard by people living nearby, but nobody dared to complain or investigate. Amin's hatred was not limited to soldiers and politicians. He began targeting anyone with education or skills that he saw as threatening. University professors were arrested for teaching ideas that Amin did not like. Doctors were killed because Amin thought they knew too much about the human body. Lawyers were executed because they understood the law better than he did. Even primary school teachers became targets because they could read and write better than the dictator. The intellectual class of Uganda was being systematically destroyed. Libraries were burned, schools were closed. Hospitals lost their best doctors and nurses. The country that had once been known for its educated population and strong institutions was being dragged back into darkness by a man who feared knowledge and learning. Religious leaders also became targets of Amin's violence. He suspected that churches and mosques were places where people gathered to plot against him. Priests and ministers who preached about justice and human rights were arrested and killed. Even religious ceremonies were monitored by government spies. Faith, which had always been a source of comfort for Ugandans, became another source of danger. The economy began to collapse as Amin's violence spread. Business owners fled the country or were killed. Foreign investors stopped bringing money to Uganda. Trade with other countries decreased as word spread about the chaos and killing. The roads and railways that connected different parts of Uganda fell into disrepair because the skilled workers who maintained them had been murdered or had escaped to other countries. Ordinary Ugandans found themselves living in a world where the rules changed every day. What was legal yesterday might be a crime punishable by death today. Speaking to the wrong person, visiting the wrong place, or even wearing the wrong clothes could lead to arrest and execution. People stopped going out at night. They avoided gathering in groups. They taught their children to be silent and invisible. The international community began to hear rumors about what was happening in Uganda, but many world leaders still supported Amin publicly. They thought the reports of mass killing were exaggerated. Some believed that a strong military leader was exactly what Africa needed. Others were more concerned about protecting their business interests than about human rights. This international support gave Amin confidence that he could continue his reign of terror without consequences. By the end of 1972, thousands of Ugandans had been killed, tortured, or had disappeared. Entire families had been wiped out. Whole communities lived in terror. The country that had celebrated Amin's rise to power less than 2 years earlier was beginning to understand the true cost of their support. But it was too late to change course. The monster was fully in control, and the worst was yet to come. Uganda had become a nation where death stalked the streets, where fear was the only law, and where a madman's paranoia determined who lived and who died. The reign of terror had begun, and it would only get worse. On August 4, 1972, Idi Amin made an announcement that would destroy Uganda's economy and change the lives of thousands of innocent people forever. Speaking from his presidential palace in Kampala, the dictator declared that all people of Asian origin living in Uganda had exactly 90 days to leave the country. They could take nothing with them except the clothes on their backs and a small amount of money. Everything else they owned would belong to the government. This decision shocked the world, but it did not come from nowhere. For months, Amin had been building hatred against Uganda's Asian population through his speeches and propaganda. He told Ugandans that Asian families were stealing their wealth and taking jobs that should belong to Africans. He claimed that Asian business owners were cheating their customers and sending all their profits to foreign countries. None of this was true, but many people believed him because life was hard and they needed someone to blame. The Asian community in Uganda was about 60,000 people strong. Most of their families had lived in the country for 2 or 3 generations. Their grandparents and great-grandparents had come from India during British colonial times to build the railway that connected Uganda to the coast. Many had been born in Uganda and considered it their only home. They spoke local languages, married into local families, and thought of themselves as Ugandans first and Indians second. These families had built much of Uganda's modern economy. They owned the shops where people bought food, clothes, and household goods. They ran the factories that processed sugar, cotton, and other crops. They operated the banks that gave loans to farmers and small business owners. They built the hotels where visitors stayed and the restaurants where people ate. Without them, Uganda's economy would collapse, but Amin did not care about economics. He cared only about power and popularity. The Asian expulsion was popular with many ordinary Ugandans, at least at first. People who had struggled to find good jobs or start successful businesses saw it as their chance to take over Asian-owned shops and factories. Amin promised that all Asian property would be given to loyal Ugandans who would run these businesses better than the previous owners. He said this would make Uganda truly independent and prosperous. The reality was very different from Amin's promises. Most of the Ugandans who received Asian businesses had no experience running shops, factories, or banks. They did not understand how to keep accounts, manage workers, or deal with suppliers and customers. Within months, successful businesses that had operated for decades were failing. Shops that had always been full of goods stood empty. Factories that had employed hundreds of workers shut down completely. The process of expulsion was cruel and chaotic. Asian families who had lived peacefully in Uganda for generations suddenly found themselves treated as enemies. Their bank accounts were frozen so they could not access their own money. Their houses and businesses were taken over by government officials who often moved in before the original owners had even left. Many families were forced to sell their possessions for tiny amounts of money to people who knew they were desperate. At Entebbe Airport, scenes of human tragedy played out every day during those 90 days. Entire families arrived with suitcases and children, saying goodbye to the only country they had ever known. Old people who were too sick to travel were forced to leave anyway. Young people who had been planning to go to university or get married had to abandon all their dreams. The airport became a place of tears, fear, and broken hearts. Some Asian families tried to hide their wealth by giving it to African friends or burying it in secret places, hoping to return someday to claim it. Others tried to convert their money into gold or diamonds that would be easier to smuggle out of the country. But most lost everything they had worked their whole lives to build. Families who had been wealthy on Monday found themselves penniless refugees by Friday. The international community was horrified by the expulsion, but most countries did very little to help. Britain eventually agreed to accept many of the expelled Asians because they held British passports, but the process was slow and difficult. Other countries offered to take small numbers of refugees, but thousands of people remained in camps for months or years, waiting for somewhere to go. Meanwhile, Uganda's economy was falling apart. The shops that had always been full of imported goods from India, Britain, and other countries suddenly had empty shelves. The factories that had processed Uganda's agricultural products for export stopped working. The banks that had provided credit to farmers and businesses closed their doors. The hotels and restaurants that had served tourists and business travelers became empty and abandoned. Amin had promised that Ugandans would become rich by taking over Asian businesses, but most of the new owners failed completely. They did not know how to import goods from other countries. They did not understand the paperwork needed for international trade. They had no relationships with suppliers or customers in foreign markets. Within a year, most of the businesses that had been successful under Asian ownership were either closed or operating at a tiny fraction of their former capacity. The destruction of Uganda's economy hurt everyone, but it hurt poor people the most. Food became more expensive because the shops that imported it were closed. Jobs disappeared because the factories that provided them were no longer operating. Basic services like electricity and water became unreliable because the companies that maintained them had lost their skilled workers and managers. Farmers who had sold their crops to Asian-owned processing plants found themselves with no buyers for their produce. Coffee farmers watched their crops rot in the fields because the mills that prepared coffee for export were no longer functioning. Cotton growers could not sell their harvest because the textile factories had closed down. The rural economy that supported most Ugandans collapsed along with the urban businesses. By 1974, 2 years after the expulsion, Uganda had transformed from a relatively prosperous country into an economic disaster zone. The gross domestic product had fallen by more than half. Unemployment was massive. Basic goods were either unavailable or extremely expensive. The country that had once exported food to its neighbors was now struggling to feed its own people. Amin blamed these problems on everyone except himself. He claimed that the remaining problems were caused by sabotage from foreign enemies or corruption by his own officials. He never admitted that destroying the business community had been a terrible mistake. Instead, he continued to claim that the expulsion had been necessary to free Uganda from foreign exploitation. The Asian expulsion was more than just an economic disaster. It was a crime against humanity that destroyed the lives of innocent people and turned Uganda from a developing success story into a failed state.
By 1975, the world was beginning to see Idi Amin for what he truly was. The friendly soldier who had promised to bring peace and prosperity to Uganda had revealed himself as a madman and a murderer. But instead of trying to improve his image or change his behavior, Amin became even more outrageous and bizarre. He seemed to believe that the louder he shouted and the more shocking his actions became, the more respect he would earn from other world leaders. Amin had always been obsessed with titles and ceremonies, but now his obsession reached ridiculous levels. He was no longer satisfied with being called President of Uganda. He declared himself Field Marshal. then added more and more titles until his official name became a long list of meaningless words. He called himself His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Hagi, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, Conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general, and Uganda in particular. The title Conqueror of the British Empire was particularly absurd, because Uganda had gained independence peacefully in 1962, 9 years before Amin came to power. He had nothing to do with ending British rule, but he wanted the world to think he was a great liberator who had defeated the mighty British forces in battle. This was typical of how Amin's mind worked, believed his own lies, and expected everyone else to believe them too. Amin's behavior at public ceremonies became increasingly strange and embarrassing. He would arrive at events carried on a golden throne by his servants, wearing military uniforms covered with medals he had given to himself, insisted that everyone bowed down when he entered a room. He required government ministers to kneel before him during meetings and to address him using his full list of ridiculous titles. Foreign diplomats were forced to participate in these humiliating rituals if they wanted to meet with him. The dictator's correspondence with other world leaders became a source of dark comedy for people around the globe. He wrote long, rambling letters to presidents and prime ministers, offering them advice on how to run their countries. He sent a telegram to the United Nations Secretary-General, claiming that he had solved all of Africa's problems and should be put in charge of the entire continent. He wrote to the Queen of England, offering to become the King of Scotland if she needed help governing her kingdom. One of Amin's most famous letters was sent to President Richard Nixon of the United States. In it, Amin offered to help America solve its economic problems and suggested that Nixon should visit Uganda to learn about proper leadership. He signed the letter "Your Brother" and included his photograph wearing a military uniform covered with fake medals. The letter was so bizarre that it was reprinted in newspapers around the world, making Uganda a laughingstock. But while the world was laughing at Amin's crazy behavior, the people of Uganda continued to suffer and die. The international attention that his outrageous statements received helped to hide the ongoing genocide that was taking place inside his country. Every day that foreign newspapers wrote about his silly titles and ridiculous letters was another day that the mass murder of innocent Ugandans went unreported. Amin's relationship with other African leaders became increasingly strained. Many of them had initially supported him because they thought he would be good for African unity and independence. But as reports of his brutality spread, even his former allies began to distance themselves from him. The Organization of African Unity, which had welcomed him as a member, started to avoid inviting him to important meetings. The dictator's paranoia about foreign enemies reached new heights during this period. He claimed that British agents were constantly trying to assassinate him. He accused American spies of poisoning his food. He said that Israeli commandos were planning to invade Uganda and overthrow his government. Most of these fears existed only in his imagination, but they led him to make decisions that further isolated Uganda from the rest of the world. In 1975, Amin made one of his most shocking international moves. He praised Adolf Hitler, the Nazi leader who had murdered millions of Jews during World War II. Amin said that Hitler had been right to kill the Jews, and that someone should finish the job that Hitler had started. This statement horrified people around the world and made it impossible for most countries to maintain normal diplomatic relations with Uganda. The praise for Hitler was not just shocking because of what it revealed about Amin's character. It also showed how completely he had lost touch with reality. He seemed to believe that supporting the most hated man in modern history would somehow make him look strong and important. Instead, it made him look like a dangerous lunatic who could not be trusted by anyone. Foreign governments began to recall their ambassadors from Uganda and close their embassies in Kampala. International organizations stopped providing aid and development assistance. Airlines canceled flights to Entebbe Airport because they were afraid their passengers and crew might not be safe. Uganda was becoming completely cut off from the rest of the world. The isolation hurt ordinary Ugandans more than it hurt Amin himself. Medicine became almost impossible to find because drug companies stopped shipping to Uganda. Spare parts for machinery could not be imported, so factories and vehicles broke down and could not be repaired. Students could not travel abroad for education because other countries would not give them visas. The entire country was being punished for the actions of one madman. Despite all the evidence of his cruelty and insanity, a few countries continued to support Amin. Libya's leader Muammar Gaddafi provided him with money and weapons. The Soviet Union continued to trade with Uganda because they wanted to maintain influence in East Africa. Some Palestinian groups praised him because of his opposition to Israel, but these supporters were few and far between. By 1977, Uganda had become one of the most isolated countries in the world. The man who had promised to make his nation strong and respected had turned it into an international pariah. While Amin played with his meaningless titles and wrote his crazy letters, his people continued to live in fear, poverty, and despair. The gap between his grandiose self-image and the terrible reality of his rule had never been wider.
By 1977, Idi Amin's grip on reality had almost completely disappeared. The man who had once been a clever and calculating soldier was now consumed by paranoia, superstition, and an endless thirst for blood. His behavior became so extreme and unpredictable that even his closest supporters began to fear for their own lives. The final 2 years of his rule would be marked by violence so terrible that it shocked even those who thought they had seen the worst of his brutality. The killing during this period was different from the systematic murders of earlier years. Now, Amin killed people for the smallest reasons or for no reason at all. A minister who arrived 5 minutes late to a meeting might disappear that same night. A soldier who looked at him the wrong way could be tortured to death within hours. Even his own bodyguards and servants lived in constant terror, knowing that their loyalty meant nothing if Amin decided they were plotting against him. Amin's paranoia focused particularly on his own inner circle. He became convinced that his closest advisors were planning to overthrow him and hand him over to his enemies. Ministers who had served him faithfully for years suddenly found themselves accused of treason. Military commanders who had helped him maintain power were arrested and executed without warning. The presidential palace, which should have been the safest place in Uganda, became a death trap where anyone might be the next victim. The dictator's mental state was clearly deteriorating. He began to hear voices that told him who his enemies were and what he should do to them. He claimed that he could communicate with the spirits of dead people, including his own victims. He said that these spirits advised him on important decisions and warned him about plots against his life. Government meetings became bizarre sessions where Amin would pause to listen to invisible voices before making announcements. Religion became another source of confusion and violence for Amin. Although he had been raised as a Christian and later converted to Islam, he now seemed to follow a twisted mixture of both faiths combined with traditional African beliefs and his own strange superstitions. He declared himself to be a prophet sent by God to rule Uganda. He claimed that Allah spoke to him directly and gave him permission to kill anyone who opposed his rule. The torture centers that had operated throughout Amin's reign now reached new levels of horror. The State Research Bureau headquarters in Kampala became known as a place where human beings were turned into animals through pain and terror. Survivors who managed to escape told stories that were almost too terrible to believe. Prisoners were forced to eat pieces of their own flesh. Others were made to drink the blood of people who had been killed in front of them. Amin himself sometimes visited these torture centers to watch the suffering of his victims. He seemed to enjoy seeing people in pain and would often suggest new methods of torture to his guards. Some witnesses reported that he laughed and joked while prisoners screamed in agony. He had lost all sense of human compassion and seemed to view other people as nothing more than objects to be used for his entertainment. The economic collapse that had begun with the Asian expulsion was now complete. There was almost no industry left in Uganda. The few factories that still operated produced goods of such poor quality that nobody wanted to buy them. The shops that had once been full of merchandise now had empty shelves. People waited in long lines for hours just to buy basic items like soap, cooking oil, or matches when these things were available at all. Food became scarce even in a country that should have been able to feed itself easily. The farms that had once produced surplus crops for export could barely grow enough to feed the farmers' own families. The transportation system had broken down so completely that food grown in one region could not be moved to another region where people were hungry. Many Ugandans were surviving on one meal per day, and some days they had no food at all. The medical system had also collapsed entirely. Hospitals that had once been among the best in East Africa now operated without basic supplies like bandages, medicines, or clean water. Doctors and nurses had either been killed or had fled to other countries. People with serious illnesses or injuries often died simply because there was no medical care available. Diseases that had been controlled for decades began to spread again because there were no vaccines or treatments. Schools and universities had been closed or destroyed. The teachers and professors who had not been murdered during the early years of Amin's rule had long since escaped to other countries. An entire generation of Ugandan children was growing up without education, unable to read or write. The knowledge and skills that would be needed to rebuild the country after Amin's fall were being lost forever. International isolation was now complete. No major country maintained normal diplomatic relations with Uganda. Foreign journalists were banned from entering the country, so the outside world had to rely on stories told by refugees who managed to escape. These stories were so horrible that many people found them hard to believe. The scale of the killing and destruction seemed impossible for one man to accomplish. Yet somehow, Amin managed to maintain his grip on power. His security forces continued to obey his orders, partly out of fear and partly because they were implicated in his crimes and knew they would face punishment if his regime fell. The few remaining government officials stayed loyal because they had nowhere else to go. The ordinary people of Uganda were too weak, frightened, and disorganized to resist. During this period, mass graves were being filled faster than ever before. Bodies were dumped in rivers, buried in forests, and left to rot in abandoned buildings. The exact number of people killed during these final years will never be known because there was no longer anyone keeping records. Entire families disappeared without trace. Whole villages were emptied of their inhabitants. By early 1979, Uganda had become a nation of ghosts. The vibrant, hopeful country that had celebrated independence in 1962 was now a wasteland of fear, death, and despair. Amin's paranoia and violence had reached such extremes that his own downfall was becoming inevitable. The madman who had destroyed so many lives was finally about to destroy himself. In October 1978, Idi Amin made the biggest mistake of his life. Driven by paranoia and desperate to distract his people from their suffering, he decided to invade Tanzania, Uganda's peaceful neighbor to the south. This decision would finally bring about his downfall and end 8 years of terror that had destroyed countless lives and turned Uganda into a wasteland. The invasion began without warning on October 30, 1978. Amin's forces crossed the border into Tanzania and occupied a small area called the Kagera Salient. The Ugandan soldiers looted villages, killed civilians, and destroyed everything they could find. Amin claimed that this land had always belonged to Uganda and that he was simply taking back what was rightfully his. In reality, he was trying to create a foreign enemy that would unite Ugandans behind his failing regime. President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania was shocked by this unprovoked attack. Tanzania was one of the most peaceful countries in Africa, and Nyerere had always tried to solve problems through discussion rather than violence. He had often criticized Amin's brutal rule, but he had never threatened to invade Uganda or overthrow the dictator. The attack came as a complete surprise and forced Tanzania to defend itself. At first, the invasion seemed successful. Amin's forces occupied several Tanzanian towns and pushed deeper into the country. A dictator appeared on Ugandan radio to boast about his great military victory. He claimed that his armies would soon capture the Tanzanian capital of Dar es Salaam and that President Nyerere would surrender within days. He declared himself the conqueror of Tanzania and promised to expand Uganda's borders to the Indian Ocean, but Amin had made a terrible miscalculation. Tanzania's military was small and poorly equipped, but the country had something that Uganda lacked: the support of its people and the backing of the international community. While Ugandans were terrorized into submission, Tanzanians rallied behind their government to defend their homeland. While Uganda was isolated and friendless, Tanzania received help from several African countries and support from nations around the world. President Nyerere made a decision that would change the course of East African history. Instead of simply pushing the Ugandan forces back across the border, he decided that the only way to end the threat from Amin was to remove him from power completely. Tanzania would not just defend itself, it would liberate Uganda from its brutal dictator. The Tanzanian counterattack began in January 1979, supported by Ugandan exiles who had fled Amin's terror. The Tanzanian forces proved to be much stronger and better organized than anyone had expected. While Amin's soldiers had been trained mainly to terrorize civilians, the Tanzanians were fighting for their country's survival. The difference in motivation and morale was obvious from the beginning. As the Tanzanian forces advanced into Uganda, something remarkable happened. Instead of fighting to defend their country, many Ugandan soldiers simply laid down their weapons and surrendered. Some even joined the advancing forces to help overthrow the man who had terrorized them for so long. After years of living in fear, Ugandans finally saw hope that their nightmare might be coming to an end. The battles were often one-sided. Amin's forces, which had been so effective at murdering defenseless civilians, proved to be cowards when faced with real soldiers who could fight back. Unit after unit of the Ugandan army collapsed or surrendered without putting up serious resistance. The regime that had seemed so powerful when it was oppressing innocent people revealed itself to be weak and hollow when confronted by determined enemies. By March 1979, the Tanzanian forces and their Ugandan allies were advancing rapidly toward Kampala. Amin's regime was falling apart. Government ministers fled the country with whatever money they could steal. Military commanders abandoned their posts and tried to escape to neighboring countries. The State Research Bureau agents who had tortured and killed so many people now found themselves being hunted by the very people they had terrorized. Amin himself seemed unable to understand what was happening. Even as his forces collapsed around him, he continued to make grandiose speeches about victory and conquest. He claimed that he was drawing the enemy into a trap and would soon launch a counterattack that would destroy them. He promised his supporters that foreign allies would come to help him defeat the invaders. But no help was coming, and his supporters were abandoning him one by one. The dictator's behavior became even more erratic as his power slipped away. He held bizarre ceremonies where he promoted himself to new military ranks and awarded himself additional medals. He made increasingly desperate appeals to other African leaders for help, but nobody was willing to save him. The man who had once seemed so confident and powerful was revealed to be nothing more than a frightened bully who had no real friends or allies. On April 10, 1979, Tanzanian forces and Ugandan liberation fighters entered Kampala, the capital city that had been the center of Amin's reign of terror. The people of Kampala, who had lived in fear for 8 long years, poured into the streets to celebrate. They danced, sang, and cried tears of joy. Many could hardly believe that their torment was finally over. But Amin was no longer in the city to face the consequences of his crimes. 3 days earlier, realizing that his defeat was inevitable, he had fled Kampala with a small group of loyal supporters and family members. They escaped in a convoy of vehicles heading north toward the Sudanese border, abandoning the country and people he had claimed to love and protect. The man who had called himself the conqueror of the British Empire, the president for life, and the savior of Uganda was now nothing more than a refugee running for his life. He left behind a country in ruins, hundreds of thousands of dead victims, and millions of traumatized survivors. His 8-year reign of terror was finally over, but the damage he had done would take decades to repair. As the liberation forces took control of Kampala, they began to discover the full extent of Amin's crimes. In rivers and forests, they uncovered mass graves containing thousands of bodies. The evidence of genocide was everywhere, confirming the worst fears about what had been happening in Uganda during the years of international isolation. The monster had finally been driven from power, but his legacy of death and destruction would haunt Uganda for generations to come. When the liberation forces entered Kampala on April 11, 1979, they found a city that looked like it had been hit by a terrible disaster. Buildings were crumbling, streets were full of garbage, and most shops stood empty with broken windows. But the physical destruction was nothing compared to the human cost of Amin's 8-year reign of terror. Uganda had lost not just its buildings and roads, but its soul. The new government faced an almost impossible task. They had to rebuild a country that had been completely destroyed from the inside. The economy had collapsed. The education system was gone. The hospitals could not function. The roads and railways were broken. Most importantly, the people were traumatized and afraid to trust anyone in authority. How do you heal a nation that has been tortured for 8 years? The first priority was discovering the truth about what had happened during Amin's rule. Investigation teams began the horrible work of opening mass graves and counting bodies. They explored the torture centers where so many people had suffered and died. They interviewed survivors who told stories that were almost too terrible to believe. The evidence they found confirmed that Amin had murdered between 100,000 and 500,000 innocent people. The killing had been so systematic and widespread that almost every family in Uganda had lost someone. Fathers had watched their sons disappear in the night. Mothers had seen their daughters taken away never to return. Children had been left orphaned when both parents were murdered. Entire villages had been emptied of their people. The psychological damage was as severe as the physical destruction. Many Ugandans struggled to understand how their country had fallen so low. Uganda had been one of the most promising nations in Africa when it gained independence. It had good schools, modern hospitals, fertile farmland, and educated people. How had it become a place where neighbors killed neighbors and where speaking the wrong words could mean death? The answers were difficult and painful to face. Some blamed themselves for not resisting Amin's rise to power. Others wondered if they could have done more to help the victims or to oppose the regime. Many felt guilty for surviving when so many others had died. The shame and self-doubt made it even harder for people to trust each other and work together to rebuild their country. The international community also had to confront its role in allowing Amin's crimes to continue for so long. Many countries had supported him in his early years, because they thought he would be good for business or because they wanted allies in East Africa. Some had ignored clear evidence of mass murder because they did not want to get involved in African politics. Others had been too slow to provide help to the Ugandan people who were suffering. The search for justice proved to be one of the most difficult challenges facing the new Uganda. Amin himself had escaped to Saudi Arabia, where he lived comfortably for the rest of his life. The Saudi government refused to send him back to Uganda to face trial for his crimes. Many of his supporters and enforcers had also fled to other countries where they could not be prosecuted. The victims and their families never got the justice they deserved. This lack of accountability sent a dangerous message to other potential dictators around the world. It showed that someone could commit terrible crimes against humanity and still escape punishment if they had enough money or the right connections. The failure to bring Amin to justice remains one of the great tragedies of international law and human rights. Despite these challenges, the Ugandan people showed remarkable strength and determination in rebuilding their country. Schools were reopened and new teachers were trained. Hospitals were rebuilt and stocked with medicines. Roads were repaired and new businesses were started. Slowly and painfully, Uganda began to heal from its wounds. The process was not easy or quick. It took decades to restore basic services and infrastructure. The economy remained weak for many years as Uganda struggled to attract investors and trading partners. Political instability continued as different groups competed for power. But the worst days were over, and people could finally live without constant fear of arbitrary arrest and execution. Today, Uganda is a very different country from the nightmare that Amin created. It has a growing economy, improving schools and hospitals, and a young population that is working to build a better future. But the scars from those 8 terrible years are still visible. Many of the mass graves have been turned into memorial sites where people can remember the victims and promise that such horrors will never happen again. The story of Idi Amin serves as a warning to the world about what can happen when power is concentrated in the hands of one person with no checks or limits. It shows how quickly a civilized society can descend into barbarism when fear replaces law and when hatred is used to divide people against each other. It demonstrates the importance of protecting human rights, supporting democratic institutions, and speaking out against injustice before it is too late. Amin died in Saudi Arabia in 2003, never having faced trial for his crimes. He lived his final years in comfortable exile, playing with his grandchildren and enjoying luxuries that were denied to the people he had terrorized. His death passed almost unnoticed by the world, A quiet end for a man who had once commanded international attention through his brutality and bizarre behavior, but the victims of his regime are not forgotten. Their names are written on memorial walls in Uganda. Their stories are told in schools so that new generations will understand the price of allowing evil to go unchallenged. Their suffering reminds us that human rights are not guaranteed, and that freedom must be protected by people who are willing to stand up against tyranny. The legacy of Idi Amin is ultimately not about the man himself, but about the resilience of the human spirit and the power of people to overcome even the worst oppression. Uganda survived its darkest chapter and emerged as a nation determined never to let such horrors happen again. That determination, more than anything else, is Amin's true legacy and the most important lesson we can learn from this tragic period in human history. The monster is gone, but the memory of his crimes and the courage of those who survived must never be forgotten.